It's nearly been 6 months since Queen Elizabeth passed away. And she was the longest reigning monarch of the British Empire, then of England. But she never expected to be queen. See, she was born Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. Her grandfather was King George V, and her father was a younger son of the king. So she was actually third in line to be king, or to be heir. She wouldn't have never been king. But then her uncle Edward, I think the 8th, he abdicated, said, not interested, don't want it. And so that meant that her father became king, which meant she was then next in line. So she grew up in the royal family. She had that royal upbringing. And then she married a distant cousin. Anyone know his name? Lord Philip Mountbatten, yes. And they got married. They did some tours representing the royal family. And on one of those tours, she was planning to come to Australia and New Zealand. But they found out that her father, who had recently fallen quite ill, had passed away. So Elizabeth, newly married, leaves England, goes on a tour, comes back, cuts the tour short, because she is now about to become the Queen of England. And in 1952, she had a coronation and she became Queen Elizabeth II. But she was the reluctant monarch. That's what some historians have termed her as. Didn't expect to be there, didn't necessarily want to be there, but she took on the role and she lived it out, and she embodied, as Tracy said, a lot of values that we came to love, came to appreciate, and she held the position with dignity and honour, and served the world through it. So she led well, she ruled well, unlike some of her predecessors. Lionel, we were having a chat before this. Talk to Lionel about the royal family. He'd love to chat with you about it. But as you would know, being in the royal family, your whole life is on display. You live in a glass box. Everyone sees what you do, hears what you say, judges what you say, judges what you wear. Every single part of your life, people are there to criticize, condemn, judge, applaud, celebrate, whatever it might be. So being royals can't be easy. You're in the public eye, but with that, everyone not just knows about you, but everyone has the opportunity to learn about you, but also learn from you, perhaps your mistakes, your wins, what you did well, what you didn't do well. And that's really what this new series is all about. We're not looking at the royal family of England. We're looking at the royals that come from the Old Testament, the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. And as we look at them, we're going to see what lessons do they have for us today? What can we learn from them? And we're going to start with Saul. So let me give you a bit of the background as to why Saul became king. He was the first king of Israel. Before this, they had judges. And Samuel was one of the judges. And Samuel was getting old, and he had two sons, and his sons didn't exactly follow in his footsteps, ironically, kind of like Eli. His sons, they weren't going to be prophets, they weren't going to be leaders, they were, in essence, pretty dodgy. And so all the people said, hey, look, you're getting old, your son's no good, we want a king. And Samuel's like, well, you know what's going to happen if you get a king? God's told you this. If you get a king, they're going to make you do work. They're going to take your sons. They're going to take everything you produce. You're going to be basically having to serve them. And they're like, yep, we want a king. Like, it's not going to be good. Yeah, we want a king. Bad idea. Yeah, we want a king. We want to be like our neighbors. We want someone to lead us into battle. So despite the fact that they had a pretty good king who was perfect, who was just, who was fair, who was loving in God, they said, no, we want a human king. And so God said, all right, you can have your king. I'll give you a king. I'll explain it for you, Siri, later on. And the king they get, kind of like Elizabeth, is reluctant. Saul was the man that God chose. And we pick up the story with Saul when he's actually out searching for his dad's donkeys. Yeah, pretty good way to become king. All these donkeys had been lost, and so he's out looking for them, obediently following his dad and doing what his dad asked for. He finds them, he runs into Samuel. Actually, he doesn't find them, he runs into Samuel. Samuel tells him where the donkeys are, because that's what a prophet does. And Samuel says, you're going to become king of Israel. And he anoints him. Now, from reading in 1 Samuel, we get this picture that Saul, he was reluctant. He was kind of humbled by all this that was about to take place. And on his coronation day, they announce him, and they're like, welcome, Saul. And where is he? And like, where's Saul? And someone goes, oh, is he the really tall guy? Yeah, I saw him hiding in the supplies. Like, it's almost as if he doesn't want to take the role on. But God called him to it, and he does. He gets coronated as king, and everyone shouts, long live the king, long live the king. And his reign begins with a few people questioning whether he's going to be any good. Is this guy really going to lead us? He's hiding among supplies. Seriously? But he has some wins against some of their enemies, the Philistines, and he wins some favor of the people, and things seem to be going fairly well. If you've got your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to 1 Samuel chapter 15, because this is where the story shifts. 1 Samuel chapter 15, I will have some verses on the screen, but if you've got your device, your Bible there with you, I encourage you to use that, just because then you get familiar with it and you remember where it was on the page when you read it. So, 1 Samuel chapter 15, and we're going to kick off from verse 1. So it says this, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Now, if that doesn't raise some questions in your mind, then maybe I should read it again. Did you catch what God asked him to do? He said, I want you to go. I want you to go and attack the Amalekites. I want you to destroy everything. And if you're shocked by that, that's fair enough. This is, in the story of Saul, this is the giant elephant in the room, and you've got to address it, because what God's asking him to do basically seems like genocide, isn't it? Kill them all off, all of them. Now, if you don't believe in God and you're here for the first time, or you're watching this and you're listening and you're unsure about him, and this story raises serious questions in your head, then I completely understand, and that's quite okay. This is a story that we struggle to accept, struggle to understand, struggle to grasp. And many people actually look at this story and say, hey, if this is what following the Christian God is all about, I'm not interested. If this is what he's like, count me out. And I get that, because I struggle with it too. If you do believe in God, and his command here makes you uncomfortable, angry, upset, makes you ask questions, then that's okay as well. And can I suggest that that's a confirmation that you have not made God in your image? Because if he were a God who did everything you thought he should do and said everything you thought he should say, then my suggestion is that's not God. That's a creation of your imagination that you've made up. That's the kind of God that you would like him to be. But this verse says maybe that's not quite the God that he is. Part of the reason we read our Bibles, part of the reason we talk about this, part of the reason we have our discussion groups is because in isolation, it's really easy to develop your own views of God and find that he's just the kind of God that you want him to be, not the kind of God that he is. But when you gather together with other people, you discuss, you share, you have every chance of developing a spirit-led, biblical-based picture of God. And so that's what we're doing. So how do you understand this passage? How do you make sense of it? How do you grapple with it? There's a few different possible explanations that people provide. First one is, it's not accurately recorded. It's not actually what God said. God said something different. Now that's easy, but doesn't it just open up a whole other much bigger can of worms? If this isn't accurate, how do we know what is? What else isn't accurate? And it starts to make you question the rest of the Bible. Other people suggest this wasn't what God said, this is just what Samuel said. So they say Samuel's the bad guy here. He's making this up. He's given Saul some commands. He's got some inner battle with the Amalekites, so he's like, hey, let's get rid of them. So they say this is what Samuel said, not what God said. But as we're going to find out, the text doesn't really support that. And I think that's more an effort to avoid facing the challenge that this presents. It's kind of the spiritual and intellectual ostrich. Stick your head in the sand, pretend it doesn't exist, and that way you don't have to have an honest confrontation with what God is saying here. Because the passage clearly says what God wants Saul and his army to do. But then there's another option, that is, God is God and he can do what he likes. Okay, yeah, that's true. But are you comfortable with that? Does that answer the question? Does that sit well with you? Once again, I think that's kind of an easy way to say, yep, that's that, and then let's just move on. But I think if we want to be robust in our understanding of God and of Scripture, we've got to be willing to wade into this and go, what is God doing here? What is happening? The other problem that raises is, how do you reconcile that with a God who sent his only Son to save sinners with this command to seemingly indiscriminately destroy a bunch of those sinners? So, a few things to consider as we look at this. We are going to talk about Saul, but we've got to address this because it helps explain some of what Saul did. A few things to consider. What we read about here wasn't the first mass destruction in history. It wasn't the first one that God brought about. Flood. In the flood, God said, I'm going to save 8 people. Out of all the earth, we're going to save 8. I mean, everyone else had a chance, but we're going to destroy the rest of them. Now, we've kind of fairy-taled a lot of the stories in the Bible. We've kind of made them happy endings. You can go to Kurong or any other Christian bookstore, and you can get a really cool book about Noah and the flood. It's beautiful. There's rainbows and animals, and it's so much fun. There's no pictures of people drowning. I haven't gone to Kurong and picked out the Amalekite figurines yet. They're not there because we don't want to talk about this stuff because it doesn't sit well. So, we can sanitize these stories, but I think we do so at the risk of developing a really flimsy understanding of God and what God stands for and what God is about and what our world is about as well. The reality was that the flood was a judgment, and it was wide, it was comprehensive, it was all impacting, but it was still a judgment on people who had chosen not to walk in the ways of God. And the outcome of that was the flood. So is this the same situation? The Amalekites were a group of people who were right from the start against Israel. Descended from Esau. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, they were moving along, and the Bible tells us the Amalekites came up behind them and started slowly attacking all the stragglers, all the people who were lagging behind, and they just cut them down, and they took them out. That was the first time. There was another time, again in the wilderness, in Numbers, you can read about the story, where they came up against the Israelites. Another time they allied with the Moabites and the Ammonites, and they attacked Israel. And then another time, this is the time of Gideon. Gideon dealt with the Amalekites a fair bit because they attacked. But it's interesting, when you look through the history of what we have in the Bible, each time there's a confrontation between Israel and the Amalekites, it's always the Amalekites that start it. Israel never goes into their territory. They never attack the Amalekites. It's always the other way around. They are the initiators. And as a result of that, from what happened in that very first one, God said, hey, for what these guys have done, I'm going to blot their name out. That was back when they first left Egypt. We're now 600 years later. And the Amalekites are still around. We still have their name. They still exist. And so the blotting out obviously has not yet happened, but there's been 600 years for these Amalekites to experience what? Maybe a chance to see what Israel's about. Maybe a chance to see what Israel stands for. Maybe a chance to be blessed or experience the blessings that come from the God of Israel. Is God showing patience? Is God showing restraint? Has 600 years of opportunity come to an end? There's another aspect to this that we've got to consider as well. The Amalekites seemed intent on wiping out Israel. They seem intent on destroying the nation and all the people in it. Now, why did Israel exist? Why did God call Israel? Were they more special than other people? Well, God chose them and said, I want you to represent me on the earth. And through you, I will be able to bless all people. If the Amalekites had continued in their course and had been successful, what would the outcome be? If the Amalekites had gone on, would the rest of human history have had to pay the price for that? These aren't easy questions, and there's no simple answer to all of this. Sometimes it's a case of there's tough and there's tougher. But did God have to do something here for the sake of the rest of humanity? So we have to consider that there's this idea of covenant as well. And should this covenant continue, what needed to happen to protect that? In the verse, the word used to utterly destroy or totally destroy is this Hebrew word called herem. And this is a word where every time it's used, it's always used in relation to God telling the Israelites to do something for him. So totally destroy doesn't come up when the two other nations are fighting each other. It doesn't come up against when David's fighting Goliath. It is only used when God says, hey, I have a purpose for you to do this, and as you go and do it, you are doing it for me to establish something in my name or destroy something in my name for my purpose. And so every time it says totally destroy, this word is used. Now this is, as you can see, this is not a clear-cut example of, it's not simple. There's no easy answers. I can't just get up here and read a verse and say, there you go, there's a nice answer for you. Because life isn't like that. And the world isn't like that. And I think in many ways, God isn't like that either. Sometimes we need to struggle with this stuff. We need to read through it. We need to think through the whole context of Scripture to be able to understand maybe a little bit more, what is God doing here? What does this reveal to us about him and what he's like? So, one thing we do know is that God told Saul to go and do this. So, Saul does that. It says Saul attacked the Amalekites. I'll read it from here, and I left a few bits out there. It says, so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. And then he says the Kenites, who were people who helped them when they left Egypt, hey, you guys go away, don't want collateral. Verse 7, he attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to hedem, completely, totally, utterly destroy. So, did Saul do what God asked him to do? Yes, no, sort of, halfway, a little bit. The story continues. The word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king. I regret that I made Saul king because he's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. And here, the story shifts. And it's interesting. When did we last hear the word I regret? Flood. God says, oh man, I regret I did this. I regret I made mankind. Why? Because he made a mistake? No. Because he didn't make them good? No. I regret because I gave them an opportunity to live with me and walk with me and follow the way that I live. But they chose not to. They chose to do their own thing. And I think this is a really important point. God gives us choice. He creates opportunities for us, and then he leaves it to us as to what we do with that. Think of Adam and Eve. I'm going to put you in this garden. There are these two trees. One you can eat from, the other don't. Opportunity. He gave them a choice. He didn't force them, but he said, you choose what you're going to do. But no, there are consequences either way. And so the Amalekites, they had, 600 years? They had opportunity, they had choice. And Adam and Eve, Jonah, Abraham, some more of the kings we're going to look at. God creates an opportunity and then leaves it to us as to what we do with that. And it's no different with you and me today. Yeah, I think every day God creates opportunities for us to get to know him more, to work with him, to represent him in the world around us. And it's up to you and me as to what we do with those opportunities. Some of those opportunities I've taken. Some of them, I remember one time God prompted me to go and visit a friend who I hadn't seen in ages, moved down from Queensland. And so I went and caught up with them, and yeah, she shared how her marriage had broken down and a whole bunch of stuff had happened, and we were able just to talk and pray. Other opportunities God's provided, I haven't taken. And often they're the simplest ones. Am I going to sit down with my Bible and quietly spend some time with Jesus? Or am I going to catch up on the sports results from the weekend? Am I going to spend some time before I go to bed reading my Bible? Or am I going to read that other novel that's right next to it? They're opportunities God placed before me, and it was up to me as to what I did with them. And it's the same for you as well. And here we find that the people wanted a king, so God gave them Saul, and he had an opportunity to represent God, to be used by God, to make a difference, but it didn't go to plan. And so it says, I regret that I've made Saul king Why? Because he didn't follow my instructions. So Samuel goes to Saul. He goes to tell him what God has said. And watch this. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions." Isn't that just what God said he didn't do? But Saul's like, "Yeah, no, I've done it. It's all good. I did it all. Did everything you asked me to do. It's all done." So who's right here? Who's wrong? Is Saul confused? Is Saul just guilty and digging in? Or does he genuinely believe he's actually done the right thing? We keep moving through the story, and Samuel says, "All right, you follow the Lord's instructions. Why do I hear sheep? I can smell, it smells like cow. What's with that? Why is there this stuff here?" And Saul's response is, "Well, the soldiers brought them." I didn't, soldiers did. Soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we haremed everything else. We totally destroyed everything else. So first of all, he says, hang on, it was the soldiers. They thought, hey, let's give this stuff to God. Saul, it seems like Saul doesn't even want to own it. He's trying to deflect it. But also, he didn't actually do what God asked. Maybe they kept the animals so they could genuinely offer sacrifices. If you want to be cynical, maybe they kept the animals so they wouldn't have to offer their own as sacrifices. I don't know. But we do learn something from Saul here. What does God want? What does God desire? He wants full obedience. And I think what Saul teaches us is that partial obedience is not obedience. There's either full obedience or no obedience. You can't sit on this fence and say, yeah, okay, I'll obey some stuff, but not everything. I'll obey the stuff that suits, but not the stuff that doesn't. He's saying, God gave him instructions, do this. Saul did most of it. And then it goes on. Saul gives his answer and Samuel says, enough. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. I wonder what he was thinking was coming here. Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of all the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites, wage war against them until you have wiped them out. Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? And Saul says, well, but I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took the sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Saul is digging in. And when you start digging in, it's really hard to get out. And once again, we don't know if he thought he genuinely was doing the right thing or he's just trying to make up for the fact that he didn't fully obey. But it's really easy to fall into the same trap, to justify what you've done and dig your heels in and say, no, it was good. Let me spin this so I can make it sound good. And like eating an onion and having a Tic Tac thinking it's going to fix your breath. It's not going to cut it. And I don't know if you've been in those experiences, but you're there and deep down somewhere you know what the truth is, what you should be doing, what you should have done, what you should have saying, what you should have said, and instead you're going, well, hang on, no, I can probably justify this. And so you start. And as you start and you continue, it kind of gets further and further along the track and you find yourself so far down that hole that it's really hard to get out. One of the shows my girls like watching, it's one called Gigi. It's a animated girl, and it talks about Christian values and her going to church, and I'm a pastor, so you can expect that from my kids. But one of the stories in there is her mum tells her not to practice her ballet in the lounge room. And she says, okay, I won't. I'm going to go upstairs. The cat comes along, and she gets distracted by the cat, and then she starts playing with the cat and pretending she's doing ballet with the cat, and all of a sudden she's doing ballet in the lounge room. And then she hits the vase in the corner that was given by Aunt Edna, and the vase knocks over and breaks, and her mum comes in and says, Gigi, what happens? She goes, well, it's a long story. See, I heard a noise outside, and it sounded like a rubbish can tipping over, and I had a look, and there were robbers next door taking the rubbish and taking the cans. And they ran away, and they made such a loud noise that it scared the cat. And when the cat got scared, she ran over here, and I went to take her and protect her, but then she ran back that way. And as I was running to get her, she jumped up on the bench, and that knocked a book off. And when the book fell off, a car drove past. And as the car drove past, it saw the robbers, and it honked its horn, and that scared the cat even more. And then that made the cat jump on top of the bench above the books, and that knocked off the other vase, which knocked off that vase. Her dad comes home, and he says, Gigi, what happened? And she tells a completely different story. But it's this trap of going deeper and deeper into this space where we're trying to justify what we've done. Whereas sometimes, or maybe every time, it's easier just to say, yeah, God, I messed up. I'm sorry. Saul's listening to Samuel, and Samuel isn't finished yet. Samuel says this, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. You keep reading through Saul's story, and you'll see how that almost prophecy comes true. But more than sacrifice, God wants obedience. And I think one of the things we can learn is that, sorry, I missed one bit. He finishes up by saying, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you as king. All because Saul didn't obey. And I think what we learn from him is that sacrifice is a part of an obedient life, but it's not a substitute for it. So you can say, God, my career is for you. I do all that I can. I attend church regularly. I'm part of a Burwood group. I'm paying tithe. I'm doing all that stuff. But if he says, I want you to love your neighbor, and you don't like your neighbor, then all that sacrifice that you're providing to God is not a substitute for the obedience he's calling you to. The consequence for Saul was that he went from a reluctant king to a rejected king. And if that seems drastic to you, maybe it is. But I want to suggest that that's only drastic if we underestimate the consequence and the seriousness of sin. See, the atrocity against the Amalekites, what God called him to do, seems excessive only if we don't fully understand the seriousness of sin. Sin is separation from God. God is life. Sin is separation from life. Sin is this choice to disobey and go against the way God's called us to live. And its natural outcome always is its death. Sin unstopped destroys everything it touches. Maybe that's why God asked Saul to deal with the Amalekites. And I think it's the same for us. Sin untouched destroys everything it makes contact with. I had a kidney transplant almost a year ago now, and you'll notice a bald patch on my head. You've probably seen that, but have been polite enough not to ask me about it. That's where they put the kidney in. Technology is amazing. No, when I was about to go in, the night before, they, knowing that I was going to be on a bunch of immunosuppressants, if you have a transplant, you're much more likely to develop skin cancers. And so they looked me over and said, "Oh, don't like the look of that one. We're going to take that out." So I was lying in the hospital bed, and the nurse had come over, and he had all this stuff. He got it ready. The dermatologist doctor came over, and he started slicing and dicing and making a royal mess of everything. But as a result of that, they said, "We want you to get checked regularly." So about 3 months after my operation, I went to the dermatologist clinic, and they had a look, and they said, "Yeah, look, there's a few that we don't like. And this one up here was one of them." I said, "So what are you going to do?" They said, "Well, we're going to have to cut it out." "Okay, so what does that mean?" "Oh, you'll probably need a skin graft." I'm like, "Okay." "Will the hair grow back?" Maybe. Most likely not. I'm like, "Well, I'm going bald, so it doesn't really matter." But I said, "Is there another option?" He said, "Yeah, there is. We can do a cut all the way down here and just like pull your whole scalp up a little bit." I'm like, "Let's just go to skin graft. It sounds a lot easier for everybody." But they wanted to get rid of them because if you don't deal with the skin cancer, it develops into so much more. It destroys everything that it reaches and touches, just the way sin does. And so if we give oxygen to the things in our lives that draw us away from God, that disconnect us from Him, they will consume us. I guarantee you they will. If it's a desire for money, power, comfort, stuck in addictions, anger, hatred, apathy, all those things have the ability to overtake, to pull you down, and to steal the joy, the purpose, the meaning, the life from you. Now, Saul was given a role to be an instrument for God, to bring an end to the sin of the Amalekites. But ironically, it was his own sin that got in the way. His pride, thinking he knew better than God did, doing things his own way, not owning up, but trying to pass the buck. And the consequence for him was that he lost the kingdom. We learn from Saul that obedience to God is the basis of a relationship with Him. Now, that's probably not popular to say, and that's probably not what you may want to hear, but I think that's the truth of what comes out of this story. We learn that we can't pick and choose what we obey. We're called to obey what God teaches us. We learn that instead of deflecting blame, we need to own it, and to do so with humility. And we learn that sin is serious, and God doesn't want it to continue. And that's where we meet another king. This king didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but yet he was fully God. This king knew no sin, but became sin for us so that in him we might get to become one with God. This king was not reluctant, but he was willing and obedient to God, even obedient to death on a cross. And he did that so that you and I could be free from the power of sin. God doesn't want you to live in it, and he came to actually give us the choice and the opportunity to be free from it. And that's why there's no one like him. He's the ultimate king. And we're going to keep coming back to Jesus through this series, because as we look at all these different kings of Israel, we find there are things we learn from them, but we find that they are pointers to who the greatest king is. They give us glimpses of of aspects of Jesus and aspects of God, but they just keep saying, we're falling short, we're falling short. But there is one who doesn't fall short, who is perfect and who is the one who can truly bring about the good kingdom. So I want to encourage you as we go through this series to dig into the Old Testament. Read through the stories of the kings. But as you read through them, look for, hey, how does this reveal the gospel? How does this reveal Jesus? And what do we see in this story that God's calling us to obey?